Alright, in this tutorial you're going to learn how to make a lower thirds animation like the one you've seen on the news or on sports shows where there's a name and maybe some other stuff at the bottom of the screen identifying the person, maybe some branding, etc. So we're going to start with a simple one. We've kind of done this already once before. When you open up After Effects, you're going to see the start screen. It may show a bunch of previous projects, it may not. If we just choose new project, like nothing happens except for here's the interface. So the interface shows the composition area, the timeline, which is empty, the project panel, and some other panels we'll get into later. So the first thing we need to do is make a composition, which essentially is a timeline. In Premiere, it's a sequence, and in this program, it's a composition. So the composition, when we make one, is going to be 1920 by 1080. We see it's HD TV 1080. And that's just in this list, and it's HD, at the bottom of the HDTV section. So that's good to use. You want to make sure you're using square pixels. If you don't use square pixels, things get looking kind of weird. 2997 is our frame rate with a decimal right there between the nines. And we're going to go with a 15-second duration. Now, if you change this, you can go 15 like this. If you change it, make sure that it winds up. If you type that without the punctuation, it makes it up for you. So it goes, okay, there's going to be a semicolon right there, and you hit tab and it puts the punctuation in for you. So it's kind of slick and easy. The default, I think, is 10 seconds. And 15, we can trim it or add to it later. In Premiere, it makes it as long as you add clips into, and in After Effects, it just builds it at the size you specify, and you can, of course, change it later. So I'm going to click OK on this, and I want to make sure I'm zoomed out as far as I can be. I want to view fit, so I fit the whole screen on there. Now, we need to make a shape, and we're going to put some stuff in here. So if I right click down here, we're going to choose shape layer, and the shape layer is empty. There's like nothing in it, so we have to add a shape, which is a couple steps long, frankly. So if I choose the add button and choose rectangle, we have a rectangle, and again the rectangle has no fill, it's empty. So we need to add a fill. You could add a stroke if you want to, change the fill color, and you want to think about the colors you're using, because it shouldn't make this piece the most important or most visible thing in the screen, but it should be visible enough. It's like second or third priority. So I'm going to make it kind of grayish, and you can always change it later. And I'm going to use the rectangle path right here in the composition to change the size of it. So the rectangle path, if I unlink the aspect ratio to constrain the proportions, you don't want to constrain the proportions right now. You're going to make it nice and wide. And you don't make the whole width of the screen. You're going to make it almost, maybe 2/3. And we can actually add a bunch of shapes to this. And now that we've got that in place, you can use the transform for the shape to position. You can also just grab it, frankly. But before we do that, let's add some text to it, because we're going to want to link the things up. So next we're going to add in some type. I did zoom in a minute ago, and so what I'm going to do here is zoom out. So zooming out again is done in the zoom menu, and I'm going to go to fit. And so this gray area back here is actually my entire work area, my screen, my video would be there. I don't have it in there yet, or I probably won't at all. But learning how to do this is you're going to add this to a piece of video about yourself. So when I get the type tool, there's a couple ways you can do this. You can add there. You can also right click and say new text, and then it starts writing the text right in the middle. So I'm just going to put a name here. So just for fun, I'm going to put Robert Plant. Now the last thing I used this project for, this software for, I used this this font, which is called Bauhaus 93. And so I can see my character panel over here. If you don't see your character panel, look in the window menu, and you'll find it alphabetically right there. And I dragged it up a little bit so I can make sure that all the controls of it were visible. And you could probably detach it and float it if you wanted to. I'm going to change by pushing Control A my font to something more standard. And font is really important when you're making the lower thirds, because it really reflects something about the style and the flavor of the piece you're making. So sometimes you want to stick to something pretty straightforward. Arial's a good choice. I want to go with Arial Bold or Arial Black. There's actually an Arial Black. So if I choose black on this, it's going to be nice and bold. That may be too big. Let me just go to bold then, I guess. Okay. So I can also change up the size. Let's go with like 66 or something like that, 72. I seem to like numbers that are divisible by 6. I think 72 is. So I'm going to put this here. Now, as you can see, I now have two layers in my composition. I have the text layer and I have a shape layer, and I want them to travel together as much as possible. I'm also going to add another animation to it later, so this one's a little more complex. So to make sure they always stay together, I'm going to parent one to the other. So I'm going to parent the text layer to shape layer one. That means when I move one, the other one is also going to move. So if I choose the shape layer, transform, and I move the position around, you'll see they're always going to go together. And that's going to make it easier for us to animate only one instead of animating both. Now there's other ways you could do this. You could animate the rectangle and then the text, but with this case we're just going to move them together but add something else in a few minutes. So the starting position of this, once we've got this assembled, is we're going to take the shape layer and maybe we want to determine the end position of it first. And good if you figure out how long it's going to take to travel there. So what I usually do is I just kind of like move my mouse, my cursor, and I count 1 1,000, and maybe stop it in there 1 1,000. It's going to go fast. So like 1 second to bring it into play. So I'm going to zoom in on my timeline, move over. It's going to start at 0, but let's go to 1 second. So here's 1 second in my time here. You can also choose this point here and go to time. And you can also just drag your cursor, which sometimes it's just easier just to type in 100 and it'll turn into 1 second. So now I'm at 1 second of my timeline. So now I'm going to position it where I want it to be when it's finished. So I'm going to put it here, and that's my ending position. Now at this point I need to add a keyframe. So my keyframes are added in the timeline. There's only place you can do it is there for this particular transform. So I'm going to find the transform for the shape layer. I'm going to find a position, and I'm going to add a keyframe. Now the keyframe represents itself as a little blue diamond down here, and what that means is it's holding the value for that position at that point in time. So to move this into place, we're going to go back to 0, or shortly after 0, whatever, and we could drag it, and I'm going to use Shift to drag it all the way off screen. So now when I change the value at a different point in time, it automatically makes another keyframe. You do not want to use the time vary stopwatch, this little stopwatch here, unless you're going to add the first keyframe or clear all of them. So when I click this, right now I've got 2 keyframes. If I click it again, all gone. So Control Z to bring them back. So to add a new keyframe, you simply change the value either by changing the values listed here or by dragging the object around. So now I have animation. It does this. So the speed of it, like this. You can bring it in from the other side. Typically we move these horizontally most often. Sometimes they just show up or fade into place. We're going to add something fancy to this one. So that once it arrives, we're going to add a line to it. So I'm going to get, actually there is no line tool. So what I'm going to use is make another shape layer. So I'm going to right click, new, shape layer I think. And here we're going to add a path. So I choose the add button, and the add button again is visible here. Same add button is down here. So I'm going to choose, let's see, I want to add a path. So to add the path, I'm going to use the pen tool, and I'm just going to put an underline here. So I'm going to click there, and I'm going to Shift and click over here somewhere. So there I've got a line. Notice if I click away, I don't see I may not see the path anymore, but the path has no line on it. So I'm going to add on this one a stroke. So there's this added a stroke. We don't see the stroke yet. So let's see, we can make the stroke thicker. So if I open up the stroke section here, and I want to find the stroke thickness, stroke width. There we go. And I can't really see it. It's white. So I want to change the stroke color from this to like red. You could try red. And that's going to call a lot of attention to itself. So again, the lower thirds animation is not the main player. It's just a supporting actor. So I feel like that's too thick. So I'm going to change my stroke width to a little bit less, like this. All right. So now that's what it's going to look like when it's done. Now what it's going to see is it's there. So we want this to show up after the animation stops. So to do that, I'm going to add something called a trim path. So let me close the stroke and the path and the contents even. We're going to add a trim path. So I'm going to add to the contents this and a trim path. What a trim path does is it reveals parts of any path or line based on the speed that you set. So if I go to this 1 second position and I choose trim paths and open it, it has start and end and offset. So if I start it and I notice the start is 0 and the end is 100, if I change this to 0 or change this to 100, determines which way it's going to go. So we have some choices. Which way should we start this line from? So I could go this way. We can go this way. You can go from the middle. I think I'm going to go with this. So I'm going to set the start to 100. I'm going to add a keyframe right there. I'm going to go down the road like maybe 15 frames or half a second. And half a second, how many frames that is determined by what your frame rate is. So if you're doing things at 60 frames a second, half a second will be 30 frames. So I'm going to go to my start here and change that to 0. So now when it moves into place, it's going to do this. It stops and the line shows up. So that's a good start for our lower thirds. And what I want you to do is add a picture or something to this, and edit this into, add some video to this, and you can add your video straight in here. So what I'll do next is I'm going to add some video to wrap this up. Okay, so now I'm going to just to wrap this up and show you how to add, in this case, a photograph to your composition. I'm just going to grab an image I just made by capturing it somewhere, and I'm just going to drag it into, and I'm dragging and dropping it from a folder into my composition project panel. So I can drag this, and I'm going to collapse all my layers. This works just like layer panel in Photoshop and Illustrator. So I may want to rename these layers, by the way. So if I rename this, I'm going to call this line. I'm going to call this one block. And the text layer will name itself. So if I drag this into play here, okay, now I can see it didn't show up quite the size it should be. So I open this up and I'm going to choose transform. If you push S for scale, it shows me just scale. Although it does that for all these, I'm going to just use this for that layer. So S, and I'm just going to scale this up a little bit, and it's going to do it uniformly because this link into here indicates it's going to constrain proportions. So I've got this picture. That's of course not Robert Plant now. So I'm going to now change the name. I can get in here and adjust that using the type tool. Click right in there, and when doing this, always double check your spelling. So if you're not sure, look at a directory, look it up, figure out that you've got their name spelled correctly before you add it in there. So now at this point I could change this up to add more information or content to it. So now as I've added to it, I can take the block, for example, and I can choose scale, S for scale. I'm going to unlock the proportions, make this a little bit taller. Choose P for position and move it down. Now as you can see, it's moving the name also. So now I'm going to take the name for the position for the name and move it up, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to add more text to change this up. So I'm going to click up here and I'm just going to write SBHS, and I'm going to spell that right, aren't I? SBHSD, and I spelled that wrong, but I can't see it very good, so I'm going to move it to where I can see it better. And I'm also going to make the text smaller. So we have something called the dominant text here, and I want to make sure that I'm using design principles. 10, there we go. I'm going to use design principles to subordinate this part down a little bit. So I'm just going to shrink down the size of the text. That was the wrong choice. Font size, there we go. I'm going to move this down here, and then you can change where it gets positioned. Let's see, if I move that up a little bit, I'm going to use P for position, use the vertical part, which is second, and now I'm going to link this to the block, so now they're going to travel together. And they should move in a straight line. I suspect I have an extra keyframe there somewhere, is why it's moving around a little bit. So it moved because I changed the positioning of it. And so what I'm going to do is zoom in. And so when you see it moving around like that, you want to find where it's moving. Ah, yes. So there was a mistake that I made, and it's important to note these things are going to happen sometimes. This keyframe got added when I changed the position of it based on so it doesn't wiggle around anymore. So you want to make those changes at the keyframes where they need to be. So there's over here these keyframe toggles. So this is go to previous keyframe. That's the one where I want to make the change. So at this position, I'm going to move that down, and because, let's see, I did that so it was visible. Now I do want this to be the same at both positions, the verticals. I changed the vertical of it. So if I go back to the previous keyframe, let's copy this value, Control C, go to the previous keyframe, and Control V. That way it's going to move in a straight line. So now everything goes together as it should, and it's done. So what I want you to do next is we're going to see how to make it go away. So it's going to show up long enough, which is usually time enough to read it twice. Time enough to read it twice before it goes away. So we're going to move this in. Probably that might be it. So I'm going to go to 4.5 seconds. Okay, and so now we've got 4. Let's go 4:15. I like even numbers. Doesn't really matter, I guess. So I'm going to duplicate this keyframe here, and it's going to make it stay. So between two keyframes of the same value, the same position, it's going to hold still. So we need that second one to move from there to go away. So I'm going to take the first keyframe, which was 1 second earlier than the second one, copy the keyframe, go forward 1 second, so that's going to be 5:15, and paste the keyframe. So now we have it going away. Now what's left behind is the line. So you have to decide when do I want the line to go away. So it does this, shows up, we read it for a little while, and then it goes away. Some people also fade them out. It depends on how you want to work this. We might want to make this go faster out. So how that moves in and how that moves out. So now let's take this line and make it disappear before we launch. So let me just put at this keyframe position here, or this one, that's when the line's going to be completely gone by. So let's back up by 15 frames to 4 seconds. Okay, on this line I have, and now there's a thing you can do actually. If you hit U twice, it shows you all your keyframes. So there's a keyframe for the trim path. That's what I want right now. So at this position, I'm going to duplicate this keyframe, copy and paste, Control C, Control V. I'm going to go to 4:15 and make it go away. So now the trim path is going to go back to 100%. And again, the value of the trim path control for start or end is going to vary depending on which end you're trying to move the text from. So now we have a full animation. This shows up, goes away, and disappears. So that's the tutorial. Add any picture you want in there, or I'll provide this one for practice. So make sure you post your results to your Google Drive. You're going to export this. I guess we should show you how to export. So composition, add to render queue, and like nothing happens, right? So it should show up in our render queue somewhere. Look, it's thinking. There it is. The render queue shows up down here at the comp. You can always go back to the comp, but we got to render first. So there's a few controls in here, and exporting as an AVI for now is fine because for reasons beyond my understanding, there's not a lot of other choices in there. So you're just going to click render. The blue line shows up and disappears. Where did it go? Well, it went to where it wanted to go. So make sure that when you choose these settings, that let's do this again. Go back to here. Make sure you have the composition selected that you want to render. Again, it's composition, add render queue, and the thing that we have to do here is output to and tell it what folder to go to. So this is not where I wanted it to go, and it got lost. So if it disappears on you, you don't know where it went, then you got to find where it went to. So it'll usually show you if you click on that, but we want to put it where I want it to go from the first, and just be in the habit of selecting that immediately. So let's see, I've got this A toots, lower third. I'm going to call this finished sample. Click save, and then render it again. So now when I go to that folder, it's going to be where I want it to be. Another trick that you should be aware of is when you open up your file browser, if you open up the quick access, it's going to show it as one of the most recently files created. Now this doesn't mean that it's in this folder. If I right click on this and say somewhere open file location, now it's in that folder. So make sure you upload to your Google Drive, provide a link in the assignment, and you're good to go. Peace.